The hypocrisy of tenured white professors pushing white privilege in their classes. Next on Campus Roundup. Hello, I'm Dr. Duke, and this is the Campus Roundup at the College Fix. Our top story segment focuses on the seemingly never-ending topic of white privilege on college campuses. To talk more about this, we welcome Matthew Stein, a political science and economics major at Swarthmore College and a journalist for the College Fix. Matthew, it is a great pleasure to be with you today.
Thank you so much for having me again. It's a pleasure to be here.
You wrote a really great article about what's going on at Coe College in the breadbasket of America, Iowa. Give a little bit of background about your story.
So basically, they're holding this conference. It's called a White Privilege Symposium. It's going to be for both educators, students, and anyone who wants to join. Basically, they're going to be having a bunch of different workshops about various ideas and leftist racial philosophy, about white privilege, intersectionality. And the highlight, as you can see in the title of that, is there's going to be this social justice video game in which the participants will apparently play a black person going to a corner store and trying to return home safely. Supposedly, they'll encounter different microaggressions from both people and law enforcement, and they'll be experiencing a range of different microaggressions that could be from humiliating to lethal. In terms of what the response I got from the university, it was very little. Both from the university and from the keynote speakers that I contacted. They were pretty vague, didn't give much answers. Basically, the university just kind of sent me some of the descriptions of the various workshops that are offered rather than directly answering my questions. In terms of the keynote speakers, one of them declined to comment. Another one didn't reply, and then the last one only answered one of my questions in defining white privilege, and actually defined it historically, which is a very interesting thing because she basically described some of the racist laws that have existed in this country over the last 250 years. And so the last one being in 1952 that she mentioned. So that was very interesting to hear because most of the time, as we were saying, we're talking about this narrative of this racist oppression that goes on in this country today. So they were very interesting and vague answers at the same time.
Yeah, it's interesting to me. The very concept of white privilege seems to be itself stuck in history. It seems to be frozen in the moment where we had really racist laws, Jim Crow, segregation. To try to talk to people who promote the idea of white privilege as an evolving thing, the idea that cultures evolve, that we're not the same country we were in 1950, boy, they don't want to talk about that. And the one person who bothered to write you back basically went all the way back to 1972 to foreground what she was going to talk about.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's really just an insane idea, this white privilege talk. Essentially, they're just looking at everybody as groups, and so they say they see disparities in economic outcomes between groups, and then they say, oh, it must be because of discrimination, and they don't look at all of the individual. And they do the same thing with crime statistics and pretty much anything where there's a disparity. And as many people have pointed out, and it's self-evident that there is obviously going to be disparities in groups, even without discrimination. Perhaps discrimination is part of it, but it's certainly not the grand factor that everybody on the left likes to promote.
Well, I know enough history to know that if you want a society where everybody has the same outcome, that's called socialism. And that's one that's one issue, that's one solution that will get rid of all difference, but I'm not sure quite in the way that these progressives want it to.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, they like to point out, they like to talk about socialism all the time, and then obviously the moment you bring up Venezuela, where people are starving in the streets and protesters are being beaten brutally by the existing administration, then they really don't like to talk about that part, and then they'll say that real socialism hasn't been tried. And that is the solution for everything. It's more big government.
That's a great article. To read more stories like this, visit thecollegefix.com, and don't forget to follow us on Twitter and Facebook. Keep up the great work, Matthew. Great article. Time now for Talking Campus, our weekly discussion with members of the College Fix editorial team. Today I'm joined by College Fix assistant editor Daniel Payne for a continuing conversation about white privilege. Daniel, thanks for being here.
Duke, always good to be here.
Well, the Fix has done such a fantastic job chronicling the insanity that is white privilege and how big this is. It's become a money-making cottage industry for universities. Talk a little bit about the idea of white privilege and some of the hang-ups we should have before we're too willing to cede to the left that this is an actual thing.
Yeah, I mean, so white privilege really has become one of the biggest buzzwords on campus and in a lot of progressive identity politics. And what it's supposed to signify is that white people have some sort of unearned unfair advantage in daily life and throughout society. And as with a lot of things, there's some historical accuracy to this in that, for many years, white people did sort of have this advantage above certainly black people who were, first slaves and then discriminated against under Jim Crow. These days, instead of just acknowledging that historicity and sort of developing a coherent theory out of it, these days white privilege has just basically come to mean that a white person can't really say anything without being dismissed. If a white person wants to talk about certain aspects of politics, about racial issues, white privilege is used as sort of this blanket dismissal of any sort of discussion or debate, and it's really pernicious and has served to stifle a lot of discourse in this country.
Look, I'd have a lot more respect actually for the white privilege mongers if that was actually true. If white people, period, weren't allowed to speak, then we'd know where we stood, right? It would still be fascist. It would still be censoring. And yet, at least it would be consistent. The problem I have is that white people do get to speak. If you're a white progressive liberal professor, which is 97% of the white privilege movement on college campuses, I might add, then you get to say whatever you want. Then you get to somehow be exonerated for your white guilt while you silence your white students.
Right, and I mean, certainly, even the white professors have to approach this with sort of a cat o' nine tails on, whipping themselves on the back the whole time. But yeah, it certainly really seems to be the case that white privilege just comes to be a way to silence white people with the wrong opinions. The folks who are willing to cede to progressive identity politics and to kind of radical racial politics, they're the ones that are able to speak, and everybody else isn't quite so lucky.
I'm surrounded at my university job by these smugly woke professors, and you mentioned the cat o' nine tails, right? There's always the perfunctory, right? White people hang their head for a moment, and then as white people, they go about lecturing the rest of us about why we're the problem. One of the challenges I've thrown down before, I have never known a single white professor, not one, who voluntarily gave up their tenured sinecure to allow a less qualified minority into that position. That's what they're arguing we must do across every aspect of culture, except for their tenured positions.
Yeah, I think when they say that, they really mean you, Duke. I don't think that. I think for them, the rarefied position that they're in, they see themselves as being crusaders for this brand of racial justice, and so they don't have to give it up. What they mean is that white folks who don't agree with them on racial politics and even on a broader set of domestic policies, those are the ones that need to step down and flagellate themselves and debase themselves before the body politic. So you definitely see that it's not just sort of this sincere ideology; it's very opportunistic as well.
White privilege and cultural appropriation, they're two sides of the same coin. I've taught at 7 different universities, and at all 7 of those universities, African-American literature in the English department was taught exclusively or co-tandem by white people. White women in particular, at every university I've taught at, have taught African-American studies. And I simply ask the rhetorical question, if you are a progressive, white, privileged woman, how dare you appropriate African-American culture to teach it in the classroom? It doesn't bother me who's teaching the class, but why are these obvious contradictions in their own ideology never even noticed?
Yeah, it's surprising that you don't see that. You see consistency in some other areas, but certainly not in that one. They're preaching this ideology, and then at the same time, seemingly appropriating that which they've said is not right to appropriate. When you see that sort of thing, you kind of get a sense for how unserious it all is, right? That it really it's for opportunism, it's for kind of showboating, and at the end of the day, it really this silly ideology doesn't have any firm footing on any meaningful ground.
I love the way you phrase that. When you stop and look at this intellectually, it doesn't hold any water. It's shocking to me how many highly educated PhDs are rewriting the culture based on exactly these kind of ideas. Ideas that have no substance to them, ideas that have no intellectual history behind them, made up ideas that are designed to do nothing more than alter culture in a way that seems to favor their politics.
Yeah, and really the most effective kinds of politics are the ones that confuse people, that twist them and turn them and make people kind of shut down their critical thinking skills in favor of just sort of going along with the flow. And that's really what so much of campus progressive politics is about these days. In particular, the whole sort of white privilege charade is it's meant to just kind of bamboozle people into confused silence. And in that, it's pretty effective on a lot of campuses, as I'm sure you know.
Well said. Be sure to stay up on all the latest news and information from the College Fix editors by joining us on all of our social media platforms. Daniel Payne, thanks again for your time today. The more we hear about white privilege, and we're hearing about it all over, the more I get uneasy about the concept. Seems to me that you have a concept, white privilege, that was more or less invented by white tenured university professors. White tenured university professors have theorized this construct of white privilege, and then they are using that construct to attack other white people, thereby indemnifying themselves from the collective racial guilt that they point to, but now haven't managed to escape somehow. There's something really, really self-serving about that. If these white professors were really serious about white privilege, you would think they would start with their own privilege. And there are few white people in culture today, in America today, who are more privileged than tenured white university faculty. Name another profession where after 6 years you get tenured effectively for the rest of your life, and barring cataclysmic events, you cannot be removed from your position. If these white theorists of white privilege really wanted to be down for the struggle, they would step aside and let minority candidates take their places rather than lecturing the rest of us how many sacrifices we have to make to mend our racial history. And that's the Final Fix. I'm Dr. Duke, and we will see you next time.